Despite Napoleon Bonaparte's fame, so few people know his real story or his dark secrets. For example, although he was madly in love with his Empress Josephine and wrote her a tremendous amount of graphic love letters, he likely didn't realize how futile his efforts were, and all for a twisted reason. Even his origins are a plot twist. Most know he was born in Corsica, but this also meant that Napoleon's first languages were Corsican and Italian. Even after he moved to France, he spoke with a heavy Corsican accent all his life. He got bullied mercilessly for this, and some historians believe that this is what gave him the inferiority complex that would drive him from then on. As he grew up, though, he certainly didn't get bullied. People found him hypnotically persuasive, and he had a sharp, organized military mind that could view the battlefield like a chess match. His age-old enemy, the Duke of Wellington, would later comment that his presence on the field was worth 40,000 men. All this won him big points when the French Revolution came along, and he began fighting for it. By the time he was a young man, he was already famous around Paris for his battle prowess, which is about when he met his future wife, Josephine de Beauharnais. Only, this was no fairy tale. First, Empress Josephine, as we think of her today, was utterly unrecognizable when Napoleon met her. For one, her name wasn't Josephine. At the time, she went by Rose, but Napoleon decided he hated the name and chose Josephine instead. Okay then. Josephine was also 6 years older than him and had been making a living mostly as a mistress for powerful Frenchmen before she met Napoleon. Nonetheless, it was obsession at first sight for Napoleon, who sent her impassioned TMI letters around this time exclaiming, "I awake full of you. Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses." Ew. As if that weren't enough, he kept a portrait of her in his pocket and took it out every hour to kiss it tenderly. His family hated her. His sister Pauline not only named her La Vieille, or the old woman, she took great pains to humiliate her, commissioning extravagant dresses to outdo Josephine at balls. As for Josephine, well, she'd been around the block, and her new suitor's undying devotion kind of creeped her out. She once wrote nervously to a friend, "Napoleon doesn't love me. He worships me." When they got married just months after meeting, this indifference showed. On their wedding night, Josephine refused to move her adored pug dog Fortune off the marriage bed so that Napoleon could cuddle up with her. Then, when Napoleon tried to shift the pup, Fortune bit him. But Josephine was about to dig the knife in deep. No sooner than Napoleon had left on his next campaign in Egypt than Josephine turned into a naughty girl. She started racking up gambling debts, but that wasn't all. She also began an affair with the dashing Lieutenant Hippolyte Charles. This backfired. Inevitably, the gossip about Josephine's affair reached Napoleon all the way out where he was stationed with his men. His retaliation was good old Testament revenge. In an eye for an eye way, Napoleon started up his own affair with Pauline Four, the wife of one of his officers. Because the French army were invading Egypt, people took to calling Pauline Napoleon's Cleopatra. But if Josephine thought his vengeance would stop there, she was very wrong. This episode also fundamentally changed Napoleon's perception of his love for Josephine and his relationship with her. It also changed his relationship with himself. His ego was shattered, and never again could he see Josephine with stars in his eyes. Plus, there was the total public humiliation that was about to occur. See, in the wake of Josephine's infidelity, Napoleon didn't just sleep with someone else. He also wrote to his family, bitterly complaining about his wife as a form of free therapy. But one day, the British captured a mail ship, and on that mail ship was a letter Napoleon penned to his brother detailing the affair. For the English, lifelong enemies of the French, nothing was more hilarious than publishing the letter widely, hanging out Napoleon's dirty laundry and turning him into a laughingstock throughout the continent and the British Isles. Now, I'm not saying what happened next was Napoleon's inferiority complex kicking in and trying to show them all, but, well, you decide for yourself. Not long after Lettergate, Napoleon soothed his ego in spectacular fashion by seizing control of a whole country. While he'd been on a successful campaign, France's government had devolved into infighting in the meantime. So Napoleon saw his chance, and boy, did he take it. In short order, Napoleon teamed up with another politician to overthrow the various factions fighting in Paris. And then he betrayed that ally so that he alone was the one on top. When all was said and done, Napoleon turned himself into the first Council of France in the blink of an eye. Let's keep in mind here, Napoleon started out as a revolutionary soldier trying to abolish absolute power. But this was a turning point he never looked back from. I mean, he set up his residence in none other than the Tuileries, the palace Catherine de' Medici built in the 16th century, and where Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI stayed at the beginning of the Revolution. Only he was about to suffer the first recoil on his ambitions. In December of 1800, Josephine and Napoleon were headed with a group from their family to the Paris Opera to see a show. Out of nowhere, chaos struck. Although Napoleon had, by sheer luck, gone on ahead, a bomb hidden in a parked cart intended for him exploded when Josephine's carriage came by. It killed several nearby citizens and just barely let Josephine escape with her life. It was a clear message. We see what you're doing, and we object. If anything, however, escaping with his life only made Napoleon more arrogant than ever. He even continued on to the opera that night. By now, that arrogance also extended to the bedroom. Although Josephine seems to have only taken Hippolyte as a lover, Napoleon wasn't so selective. He began taking a succession of lovers and made creepy demands of them to boot. Napoleon liked them to be waiting for him in bed, where he would stride in, do his business in minutes, and then leave. How romantic. Still, this is Napoleon, so he took it one step further. He liked to regale Josephine in detail about these conquests and insisted she congratulate him on them. If she got upset, Napoleon would go from crowing to cruel, telling her that she had strayed first and humiliated him in the process, so she deserved everything she got. And we still haven't reached rock bottom yet. As time went on in this toxic marriage, one single worry burrowed its way into Napoleon's brain. Josephine had still not conceived with him, and he wanted an heir. This became all the more important when, through a series of brilliant but shady political maneuvers designed to make him look like the only person who could save France, he launched an infamous referendum. Claiming to use ancient Rome as his inspiration, he basically asked the French, hey, should I be Emperor of France or not? Incredibly, the people who had just helped a revolution said yes. Although, in Napoleon's defense, an emperor wasn't a king, right? As one French woman of letters at the time put it, men worn out by the turmoil of the revolution looked for the domination of an able ruler. Before long, they would deeply regret this decision. Napoleon's unprecedented coronation took place on December 2nd, 1804. It was a strange omen of things to come. Although taking place in Notre Dame de Paris and gilded to the hilt, the ceremony was also dull and hollow. Its 3-hour runtime frequently sent bored witnesses wandering the surrounding halls for fresh air in the middle of the proceedings. However, when Napoleon crowned himself, because of course he did, the men stood up and waved around their hats. For good measure, Napoleon also crowned Josephine as Empress himself, doing so with her kneeling at his feet. And he was just getting started. By 1807, Napoleon was never more dominant, and his military genius was never more on display. For the glory of France, he had begun invading scads of territories. So many, in fact, that a European alliance had built up against him. Not that this helped. At Austerlitz, he routed Austria. Then, his battles against the Prussians displayed, quote, the peak of Napoleonic warfare, capturing thousands of soldiers and weapons in an unrelenting pursuit. As one historian put it, never has the morale of an army been more completely shattered. Yet still, there was one thing missing. By 1809, Napoleon and Josephine had still had no children together. It pushed him to make possibly his most difficult decision ever. He had to divorce his toxic love once and for all. The fallout was more than just brutal. Napoleon decided to break the news to Josephine at one of the worst times ever. Over dinner, right around the 5th anniversary of their joint coronation. Josephine's response was unhinged. She fell into a screaming and crying fit that Napoleon couldn't witness without crying himself too. Yet that didn't stop him from his next harrowing step. On December 14th, 1809, Napoleon and Josephine announced their divorce in an enormous and formal sort of de-coronation ceremony for Josephine. Yeah, very narcissistic, and thus so very Napoleon. In it, the pair of them declared vows of devotion to each other, even as they formally ended their union. In many ways, it was the most tender they'd been to each other for a good long while. Then, of course, Napoleon went ahead and plunged a knife into Josephine's back. In truth, before he'd even announced to Josephine that he wanted a divorce, Napoleon had already probably started scoping out his next bride. Marie Antoinette's teenaged great-niece Marie-Louise, Duchess of Parma. In any case, just weeks after their I don't ceremony, Napoleon was in marriage negotiations with Marie-Louise and sealed the paperwork that coming February. And if you thought his marriage to Josephine was rough, you haven't seen anything yet. Marie-Louise was only 19 when she and Napoleon tied the knot in March 1810, and unlike her predecessor, she had very little fire in her. When informed of her upcoming nuptials, she replied, "I wish only what my duty commands me to wish." For Napoleon, though, this docility was another strategic masterstroke, albeit one off the battlefield. That's because his intentions were cruel and selfish. As he commented to an aide, "It is a womb I am marrying." And what's better than a docile womb, right? Well, that's exactly what he got. While Josephine had toiled for years to get pregnant, Marie-Louise's belly was growing by that summer. And a year after their marriage, she had given the French emperor his long-awaited male heir, Napoleon Francois. Napoleon finally had everything he wanted. And that's when it all fell apart. Napoleon had been racking up victories on the battlefield for quite some time. Then it all went horribly, horribly wrong. Why? Because in 1812, Napoleon infamously decided he was hot stuff and could invade Russia, taking its lands for the glory of his empire. Surprise! Like so many before and after him, he couldn't. In the end, guerrilla attacks, the merciless Russian winter, and other twists of fate whittled his army down to almost nothing. He went back to France in 1812 with his tail between his legs. He didn't think so then, but this was the beginning of the end. With his stance fatally weakened, Napoleon's coalition of enemies pounced. Treating Napoleon like he was some kind of supervillain, the Allies exiled him to the tiny, remote, and sparsely populated island of Elba. To sweeten the deal, but also just to make him the butt of the joke, they allowed him sovereignty over the wee isle, and to keep calling himself emperor. Napoleon was so distraught at this news, he tried to take a cyanide pill he kept with him, only to be foiled when the pill's age made it ineffective. But fate had another cruel twist in store. Just months into his exile in Elba, he got perhaps the worst news of his life. Josephine had died from pneumonia in France at the age of 50. In response, he locked himself into his room for 2 entire days to mourn her in private, refusing to see anyone during this time. Still, this is when his enemies should have been most aware of him, because when the chips were down, Napoleon always upped the ante. In a feat of daring, he soon escaped Elba in a ship, landed on the French coast, and began going north to Paris. By this time, the government had skipped over Napoleon's line and restored the Bourbon line under King Louis XVIII, and the king's lackeys now swore they would take Napoleon to him in chains. That's not what happened. When France's 5th Regiment intercepted Napoleon on his march north, they didn't stand a chance next to his charisma. All he had to do was utter a single sentence. Upon first seeing the regiment, Napoleon dismounted from the horse he had been riding, went within range of their weapons, and announced, "Here I am. Kill your emperor, if you wish." The display of bravery was enough to turn the regiment, who began to cry, "Vive l'Empereur!" Soon, Napoleon was on his way, triumphant, to Paris. I am serious. This happened. Somehow, Napoleon had pulled off one of the greatest comebacks in history. It just didn't last long. Napoleon's second wife, Marie-Louise, was the canary in the coal mine. First, she wrote to him and said that while he'd been gone, she'd fallen in love with another man, and would he pretty please be okay if she never saw Napoleon again. Then came the moment that redefined downfalls forever after. Always looking to compensate for his failings, Napoleon had taken his expansion project back up and had recently invaded modern-day Belgium. Big mistake. Huge. At Waterloo in June 1815, Napoleon experienced, well, his Waterloo. The British Duke of Wellington and his Prussian allies notoriously routed Napoleon's forces, fracturing his power almost once and for all. Napoleon's fleeting, bloody renaissance is now called the 100 Days. His antics earned him yet another exile, this time on the island of St. Helena. But this captivity was a much darker story than before. While there, Napoleon still tried to cling to the vestiges of his power. If he held a dinner party with any of his remaining followers, he insisted men wore military uniforms and women had evening gowns and gems. Yet behind the glamorous facade was one ugly truth. Napoleon's living conditions during this time were deplorable, and his attendants often complained of colds, damp floors, and poor provisions. Over the next years, thanks in part to these surroundings, Napoleon's health declined rapidly. By 1821, the 51-year-old was on death's door. That May, after an illness confined him to his bed, the great Napoleon took his last breath and uttered his final heartbreaking words. France, the army, head of the army, Josephine, Napoleon half-raved. In the end, his thoughts were with his military might and with his Josephine. But since this was Napoleon, his end wasn't even the end. Soon after Napoleon passed, a doctor performed an autopsy on the body and committed utterly gruesome acts. For reasons that are best summed up as the 19th century was wild, the doctor cut off Napoleon's you-know-what for research. He also, a la Egyptian pharaohs, removed Napoleon's heart and guts and put them in jars inside his coffin. But for all this dissection, disturbing questions still lingered. In his autopsy, the doctor appears to have listed stomach cancer as the cause of Napoleon's swift decline and passing, although he didn't actually sign the report. Yep, this guy was great at being a doctor. The Allies were happy to accept this answer and wrap it up in a tidy bow. But years later, documents came out that put forward a much more disturbing explanation. In 1955, the diary of one of Napoleon's valets saw the light of day, and in it he described Napoleon's final months in great detail. Creepily enough, Napoleon's body was also eerily well preserved. This all led historians to an unsettling suggestion. They believed that Napoleon could have been intentionally murdered with arsenic poisoning. To be fair, that's probably not the truth. Arsenic was an incredibly common ingredient back then, and Napoleon had likely been heavily dosed with it since he was a child. Why is that somehow grosser than murder? Then there's the matter of his legacy. For all his outsized reputation and indomitable charisma, the common line of thought on Napoleon is that he was surprisingly short. It's actually worse than all that. At 5'2", he was about average for a Frenchman, though certainly some contemporaries found him shorter than they were expecting. The truth is, he was pretty much average in all physical aspects, excepting his piercing and scrutinizing glance. Overall, he wasn't extremely short, extremely handsome, or extremely anything. As one commenter put it, his general aspect was milder than I had before thought it. No wonder he wanted to be remembered. Oh, and remember those intense, impassioned, constant stream of letters Napoleon wrote to Josephine? Well, they were pretty much useless in the end. See, Napoleon usually dictated official letters to secretaries because his handwriting wasn't the greatest. But when he wrote his love letters, he paid Josephine the compliment of doing it by his own hand. As a result, Josephine simply could not understand much of what her beau wrote, and didn't read a great many of them at all. When people asked her about Napoleon's well-being, she would resort to saying that Napoleon was simply fine. History has long been divided on whether Napoleon was a hero, a monster, or merely a man. In reality, he was a mix of all three, and always fascinating. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and check out our channel for more dramatic figures from history.